Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming. We hope you enjoy the lecture tonight. My name is John Shearman, the Deputy Director here at ACOR, and I'm also here to introduce the speaker. Richard Herod is a PhD candidate in history at Washington University in St. Louis. He's currently working on a dissertation focused on the history of Oman in the 20th century. His training and research have been generously supported by the Washington University History Department, the Walter Clara Goldschmidt Foundation, the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center, New York University, Abu Dhabi, the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad, CASA, and the Council of American Overseas Research Centers. He has had the opportunity to study Arabic in Oman, Jordan, and at the Middlebury Arabic School in the United States. He is a member of the American Historical Association, Middle East Studies Association, Association for Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies, and the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. Richard holds a BA in Classics and History from Monmouth College, an MA in Middle East Studies from the University of Chicago, and an MA in History from Washington University in St. Louis. His first article, The Sultan's Treatise, Development and Contending Visions of Oman's Future in the Late 1960s, has recently been accepted by the Journal of Arabian Studies, and he will be returning to Oman this fall on a Fulbright Research Fellowship. So I'd like you all to welcome Richard Herod.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. I want to begin by thanking the American Center for Overseas Research here in Jordan for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I want to extend a special thanks to Director Kriesman, John Sherman, who just gave me that wonderful introduction, Lina Sharan, and Zovi Mananian for their help in getting me here in Jordan, as well to Katie Yost of the Council of Overseas American Research Centers and their fellowship committee for granting me the research fellowship that has brought me back to Jordan. As John mentioned, I managed to study Arabic here with CASA, so it's wonderful to be back in Amman. I lived here for about 10 months, not very far away in Shmeisani. So Amman, yani Medina Katir Helwa. And I also want to foreground a little bit about how I came to this topic before we get started. I happened to read a book some years ago while I was doing my classwork for my PhD by the historian Abdulrazik Tikriti, who wrote a book on the Dhofar rebellion. And in it, he mentioned that there were Jordanians who were involved in the fighting on the side of the Sultan. And that got me started thinking, well, what's the bigger story here? And so that is what I want to speak with you about this evening. So in a 1984 oral history interview with the Imperial War Museum in the United Kingdom, Brigadier General John David Carew Graham, the former commander of the Sultan's Armed Forces, or SAF, in Oman, during the Dhofar Rebellion of 1964 to 1975, discussed Jordan's role in defeating the revolutionary forces. According to Graham, after the 28-year-old Sultan Qaboos bin Said took power from his father, Said bin Taimur, in a palace coup on the 23rd of July, 1970, his, quote, initial and chiefest friend was King Hussein of Jordan. During the Dhofar War, especially after 1971, Jordan was, along with Iran, the most important regional ally of the Sultanate. Yet this had not always been the case. Indeed, in the preceding decades, to the extent that foreign policy of the nation of Jordan had been concerned with Oman at all, it had not been supportive of Qaboos's father during his struggle against a prior rebellion in the interior of the country, the so-called Jabal Akhdar rebellion from 1957 to 59, or depending how you count, 1954 to 1959. It's one of these that flares up and then died down and then flared up again. So on the surface, this change in Jordan's diplomatic and military policy towards Oman might appear simple. Both Qaboos bin Said and Hussein bin Talal had graduated from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in the United Kingdom. Both men were from ruling families, spoke English, and had an attachment to British military culture. And both men's countries shared a long and complicated relationship with the British Empire. However, in fact, charting the course of these two countries' foreign and military relations gives us a unique vantage point from which to better understand the relationships between the nations of the Mashriq and the Khalij in the context of the broader historical changes in the region. And this is just a map to help you get oriented. For those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of Oman, we're mostly going to be talking this evening about this region here. This is the Jabal Akhdar Massif. And then also this region down here, which is Dhofar, and specifically this area here around Salalah, the mountains and the coastal plain. And I'll show you some pictures in a few minutes as well. The Jabal Akhdar War in Oman during the 1950s took place during a time of increasing pan-Arab nationalist and anti-imperial sentiment driven by movements based initially in Nasser's Cairo and the Ba'athist Levant. The rebels against Sultan Said bin Taymour of Muscat during this conflict were able to harness this rising tide of Arabism to frame their movement as an anti-imperial struggle for national liberation, a cause that Jordan's young sovereign chose to support. On the other hand, by the time that Qaboos took the throne in Oman in 1970, the United Arab Republic had disintegrated. Nasser and his supporters had suffered the humiliation of the 1968 Six-Day War, and Jordan was facing its own internal troubles. These factors changed Hussein's understanding of revolutionary zeal from one that saw it as a source of potential political strength to one that saw revolutionary nationalism as a threat to regional stability. Jordan thus came to Oman's defense, not only because of the personal connection of its rulers, but also because of a new desire to tamp down revolutionary movements in the region as a whole. And just to foreground a little bit of my concluding argument, I will say that I think the personal connection between Qaboos and Hussein was important, but there was also a monetary element. And finally, a contextual aspect of Jordanian support for the Sultan during the Dhofar rebellion that I think had much more to do with what was happening in Jordan than in Arabia. And we'll come to that. First, we will discuss real briefly the Jabal Akhdar War as a pan-Arab cause. So like all of the imagined communities, to use Benedict Anderson's famous phrase, the Sultanate of Oman is a fairly recent creation. To delve deeply into its early modern and modern history of this important region and its powerful, if short-lived, maritime empire would require more time than we have available to us this evening. So I will start simply by saying that in the early 20th century, particularly after the British-officiated Treaty of Asib in 1920, Oman was, for all intents and purposes, two separate polities. The first was a coastal sultanate ruled, at least on paper, from Muscat, but under heavy British imperial influence, including large numbers of British administrators working in the government, handling the foreign policy, finances, and military of the country. And the interior, what was known well into the 1970s as Oman proper, was the area to the west behind the Jabal Akhdar Massif. And that was a region that had no definite borders, but was the stronghold of the Ibadi Imam, who usually ruled from the oasis city of Nizwa. And up here on the screen, this is Ghalib bin Ali al-Hinai, the last Imam of Oman. So what changed the uneasy relationship between the coastal sultanate and the interior imamate was the discovery of oil in Oman in the 1950s, specifically in the region of Fahud. And I can point to Fahud, which is out there in the desert. Fahud sat on the edge of the Rub al-Khali, or the empty quarter, and the multinational oil company, Petroleum Development Oman Limited, or PDO, with help from the Sultan's armed forces, essentially invaded the interior and annexed it on his behalf. Or, as one PDO official put it in an internal document in 1965, they carried his flag into the region in, quote, rather adventurous circumstances, unquote. The recently elected Imam, Ghalib bin Ali al-Hinai, at first resigned in defeat in 1954, but subsequently rose in revolt in 1957 and afterwards. The Imam's brother Talib, who appears to have been the real motive force behind the Imamate movement, launched a protracted guerrilla war against the Anglo-Sultanic forces, which culminated in what is usually referred to as the Jabal Akhdar War, also sometimes the Oman War, and in Arabic it means the Green Mountain War. In this phase of the conflict, the Imam and his coterie betook themselves to the mountains and used them as a base from which to conduct sneak attacks and mining operations against the Sultan's army and oil company people and property. And I'll just show you here to give you an idea of what the terrain is like. This is a handful of photos from Jabal Akhdar. I actually took that photo. And obviously I took that one. But the reason I share this one specifically with you is not because of my smiling face, but in the background there is Wadi Beni Habib, which is one of the villages that was actually bombed during the war. So it's now a tourist attraction. You can go and it's up high in the mountains and the weather's lovely, especially during the summer. This terrain, though, gives you some idea of the fact that it was of how difficult it was to conduct a military campaign. And it was not until the British Special Air Services, or the SAS, successfully chased the Imam and his supporters out of the Jabal in 1959, with the majority of them then fleeing to Saudi Arabia, that the Omani government declared the war over. Sultan Said bin Taimur rechristened the country the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman, signifying the unification of the coast with the interior, at least in name. From 1959, the Imamate movement ceased to be an existential threat within the Sultanate's boundaries, though it continued to carry out acts of violence in Oman and around the Gulf, including mining of roads, bombing of planes, banks, and ships well into the 1960s. However, for our purposes, what's interesting is the Imam's public relation campaign in the Arab world and that community's diplomatic response to it. And here is where Jordan starts to come in. In the 1950s were a difficult time for the young King Hussein, and for Jordan in general, as it attempted to chart its political future in the post-war Arab world. The creation of Israel, the subsequent wars and ongoing Palestinian refugee crisis, the revolution in Cairo in 1952, in Algeria 2 years later, the Suez Crisis, the rise of the United Arab Republic, and the uprising in Lebanon in 1958 in support of that entity, and the revolution in Iraq that same year, all unfolded against the backdrop of a waxing tide of pan-Arab sentiment. Anti-colonial and anti-imperial movements were ascendant, and Hussein was sympathetic to Arabism and politically hostile to British meddling in the Middle East. Still, he had to walk a difficult tightrope. His military was commanded by British officers at the time, but it was necessary for him to demonstrate his anti-imperialist bona fides for the sake of his own legitimacy with his Jordanian officers and people. The most famous representation of this commitment to Arabization and to Arabism, I think, was his famous expulsion of John Bagot Glubb Pasha from Jordan on the 1st of March in 1956. On the other hand, in 1955, when the Omani imamate sought admission to the Arab League and to have the same body condemn the Anglo-Sultanic overthrow of the imamate and specifically single out the British government's role for censure in a proclamation, both Jordan and Iraq appear to have watered down the resolutions behind the scenes during the negotiations. Yet, secret British Foreign Office correspondence makes clear that Jordan did ultimately support the Arab League taking up the cause of the imamate. In November of 1955, the political committee of the Arab League issued a statement in which it expressed its, quote, great solidarity of feeling of the Arab countries with the Oman imamate, as well as their readiness to make every possible peaceful effort to protect it safely. So there you can kind of see that there's a support for the imamate, but we're not going to come out and explicitly say that we condemn British involvement in Oman. In the years after the end of the Jabal Akhdar War, the imamate movement prevailed upon the Arab League to advocate for what became known as the Oman question, or the Oman issue, al-Masa'ila al-Omaniya in Arabic, to be inscribed into the agenda of the United Nations. And this question essentially sought recognition of the imamate of Oman as conducting a nationalist, anti-imperialist struggle against foreign occupiers, in their view, Muscat and Britain, and simultaneously demanded denunciation of British imperialism from the international community. Initially, Hussein seemed cool to this idea. In September of 1960, in Amman, he assured Charles Johnson, the British ambassador to Jordan, that, quote, Oman had nothing to do with Jordan, unquote, and stated that he would send the proper instructions to the Jordanian Arab League delegates, presumably for them to either vote against the resolution or otherwise lobby against it. Yet, only a few days later, Jordan appeared on the list of Arab states requesting that the UN consider the Oman question. And I'll show you real quickly here just some examples of imamate publications. So after they left Oman, they went to Saudi Arabia and they opened offices in Baghdad, in Kuwait, in Cairo, in Damascus, anywhere they could find, basically. So here's just a couple examples of their publications. Both of these come from the office in Baghdad, and here we have al-Masa'ila al-Omaniya, the Oman issue, and then over here we have Kifah Oman, or like the Oman struggle, the struggle of Oman. So the imamate succeeded in raising the Oman question every year until 1971, while Zayd al-Rifai was so vociferous in his fulminations against the British at the UN that Sir Patrick Dean, the British representative at the UN, bitterly complained in a confidential telegram that Jordan was taking, quote, a leading part in the Arab attack on us on this issue, unquote, and accused al-Rifai of spreading, quote, mendacious and malicious propaganda, unquote. Dean advocated that the British officials in Amman take the matter up with the king, although whether they did or not is unclear. Thus, Hussein's diplomatic balancing act regarding Oman began in the 1950s and continued into the 1960s. Still, this was a balance that I think was tilted, at least rhetorically during this time, in favor of anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and therefore ipso facto anti-British foreign policy on this issue. As for the Imamate movement, Imam Ghalib Talib, his brother, and other supporters in exile continue to assert the justice of their cause. Ghalib died at Dammam in Saudi Arabia in 2009. However, the Imamate movement fractured as the years went on and declined in power and relevance by the time that we get to our next subject, which is the Dhofar Rebellion. After the 23rd of July, 1970 coup, in which Qaboos deposed his father and became Sultan, Jordan's foreign policy regarding Southeast Arabia began to change. In Oman, a new, larger, better organized, and more effective revolutionary movement had emerged in the region of Dhofar. The Dhofar Rebellion began as a regional liberation or autonomy movement in response to the repression of Sultan Said bin Taymour and his tendency to treat the region as his personal possession, or sultanic Balmoral, in the words of Jan Morris. As the rebellion grew and changed, it adopted a socialist, particularly Maoist orientation, and rechristened itself the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, or PFLOAG, which is a rather unwieldy acronym, but I'm going to be saying it a lot this evening. And they renamed their movement from the DLF, Dhofar Liberation Front, to the PFLOAG in 1968. By the time that Qaboos came to the throne, the revolutionaries controlled much of Dhofar, and the British were once again intimately involved in managing the campaign against them. And I'll just give you a few quick shots of what Dhofar looks like, which I think helps make clear why the Sultan really liked living there. And I should say, for those of you who are curious, how in the Arabian Peninsula there is, what kind of appears to be like an Amazonian rainforest. This is a seasonal occurrence that happens with the monsoon. So the Dhofar Mountains trap the monsoon during the summer months as it comes up the Indian Ocean. And that moisture just sits and churns on top of Dhofar for about 3 months. Give or take. And as a result, the whole region turns green. Getting back to King Hussein and Sultan Qaboos. The two men met each other in October of 1971 at Persepolis in Iran, during the celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire, put on in lavish excess by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. During the event, Qaboos befriended both the Shah and Hussein. The Shah would become Qaboos's greatest non-British ally and most substantial military backer. As for Hussein, he invited Qaboos to visit Jordan, and the Sultan accepted. According to the British records in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, by the time of Persepolis, Jordan had already seconded a number of officers to the Sultan's armed forces. Furthermore, according to British Ambassador to Oman, D.F. Hawley, After some diplomatic visits by high-ranking Omanis in December of 1971, Jordan offered to help train SA officers here in Jordan. For their services, Sultan Qaboos made what Hawley called a contribution from his personal reserves in the amount of $2 million to King Hussein. In 1972, in an interview with the Financial Times, the king made it known publicly that he was considering sending troops to Oman. He said that no Jordanian troops, quote, as such, unquote, had been sent to Oman yet, but he continued that, quote, wherever needed, in terms of Oman or in terms of the Gulf, we have a military mission that have been sent to help. As far as Oman is concerned, this might occur in the near future, end quote. Brigadier General Graham, the commander of the Sultan's armed forces, with whom we began our discussion, noted that in 1972, Hussein promised artillery from Jordan to the SAF and, quote, these things came, unquote. Graham noted in his private diary that on the 13th of June 1972, in Dhofar, he went with the Jordanian ambassador to Oman to inspect 3 of the recently arrived 25-pound guns, quote, presented by Hussein to the SAF, unquote. Graham also mentioned that Jordanian intelligence officials were active in the war zone from at least January of 1972. From a letter from the P. Floag office in Aden, we know that what they call Jordanian, quote, political officers, unquote, whom they identified as being with Jordanian intelligence, were in the region in May of that year. In the beginning of 1975, Hussein increased his support. He sent a squadron of Hawker Hunter aircraft for use by the Sultan of Oman's Air Force, a squadron of the Jordanian Royal Engineers, and the 91st Parachutist Battalion of the Special Forces. In the P. Floag's magazine of 9th of June, published in Aden, the revolutionaries singled out these forces, stating that, quote, reactionary Iranian support force was not the only one in the campaign, unquote. They then continued, asserting that the Jordanian units in Dhofar were chosen, quote, especially those working in commando and artillery corps with elements that carried out the massacres of the Jordanian army against the Palestinian revolution in Amman and Ajloun, unquote. Finally, they claimed that these units were deluded into participating in the conflict by being told that they were fighting to defend their religion and, quote, against the dangers of communism, unquote. However, regardless of what prior combat experience the Jordanian units in Dhofar may or may not have had, we can say for certain that they did not see much battle in the war, and there was some friction between them and the SAF. This was especially the case after the SAF accidentally shelled a Jordanian company in a friendly fire incident in April of 1975. In the meantime, opposition to the war amongst ordinary Jordanians had grown. The Federation of Jordanian Trade Unions, the General Union of Jordanian Students, the Baathists, the Communists, and others all issued statements condemning Jordan's involvement. Hussein himself, though he evidently felt no ill will towards Qaboos, did feel that the British were mismanaging and perhaps even purposefully prolonging the war. After a visit to his men in Dhofar in 1975, the king made the decision to withdraw the 91st Battalion, and they left Oman in September, although the engineering battalion and a number of advisors appear to have remained for some time. And that's actually what this is a picture of. And this is a rare photo. I've only found it in one place, and it's on the Jordan Armed Forces website. And this is Hussein in Dhofar, and that's actually Sultan Qaboos there, meeting with Jordanian soldiers. As far as the withdrawal goes, Qaboos appears to have been understanding. In a rare interview with the Lebanese newspaper Al Hayat, he averred that he felt Arab participation in the Dhofar War was a, quote, duty, unquote. And he was confident that his Arab brethren wished to support his efforts even more. But he added that there were, quote, circumstances that do not help them at the present time. And I think they know the danger, and they are with us heartily, but the military support could cause them embarrassment or could open a front for them that they do not need, unquote. He concluded that he did not wish Oman to be a burden for its friends they could not handle. Hussein's withdrawal of the 91st Special Forces Battalion on the 23rd of September 1975 concluded the principal participation of Jordan in Oman's war. Though I think I should also mention that Qaboos and Hussein remained on good terms, as have their two countries in the years since. So it was about Jordan, not Dhofar, or not Oman. That's what I mean by this. By way of a conclusion, I want to say that I think we can see that Hussein chose to support the cause of the Omani Imamate in the 1950s and the 1960s because it was aligned with the broader trends of the region towards pan-Arab nationalism, anti-imperialism, and anti-colonial sentiment, and his own positive inclinations towards these movements. The Imamate consistently portrayed itself as being part of a nationalist movement struggling for freedom from foreign occupation. The heavy British involvement in the Jabal Akhdar War played right into the hands of the supporters of Arabism of all stripes and confirmed the need for solidarity against imperialism. To be seen supporting such a movement was, therefore, advantageous. By the time we reached the 1970s, however, not only had the Imamate movement declined into obscurity, but the Dhofar rebellion had really eclipsed it in terms of active revolutionary movements in the Gulf. Moreover, with the success of the socialists in gaining control of South Yemen in 1967, communism, even if its practitioners articulated their message with pan-Arab language, which the Dhofari rebels did, was far more threatening to leaders in the region. Yet these facts by themselves, I don't think explain the decision of Hussein to get involved in the war in Dhofar. Obviously, the Sandhurst connection and the similarities in age, education, and upbringing played a part in the friendship between Hussein and Qaboos. I think it's safe to say that the contribution of $2 million from the latter to the former after Persepolis in 1971 also helped engender good feeling. However, I still do not think that these conditions and events are enough by themselves to explain why the king overtly committed military assets to a far-flung corner of Arabia. And I think the missing piece here is the context of events in Jordan and not in Dhofar. I keep saying that, so what do I mean? By the late 1960s and early 1970s, pan-Arabism in the vein of Nasser and the UAR was in retreat. The Six-Day War had rocked the Arab world in 1967 and driven both revolutionaries and governments to reassess the way forward. One of the changes that occurred in the Levant following 1967 was a turn towards socialism and communism among resistance movements. For example, George Habash, founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, in 1967, 2 years, founded the PFLP in 1967. 2 years later, the Maoist Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, DFLP, split off from this movement. The revolutionary movement in Dhofar turned towards socialism at around the same time, 1968. Dhofari revolutionaries and Palestinian revolutionaries knew of each other and supported one another. In fact, George Habash, had met one of the future leaders of the PFLOAG, Mohammed al-Ghassani, in Cairo in 1959 at the first anniversary celebrations of the United Arab Republic. The PFLOAG consistently supported the Palestinian struggles on their pages of their publications, and some of their fighters had apparently trained with the PFLP in Jordan in 1970. Also in 1970, Al-Ghassani of the Dhofaris held talks with Saleh Rifat of the People's Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And the two organizations published a joint announcement in August of that year, in which they stressed the importance of, quote, continued meetings, increased cooperation, and an escalation of the armed struggle in this critical historical moment which the Arab nation is going through, unquote, among other things. In 1972, Fatah offered to send cadres to Dhofar explicitly to fight the Jordanian units there. Additionally, and I should mention that the Dhofaris actually turned down this offer because they said it would be too logistically difficult. But nonetheless, that same year, Fatah did send arms to the PFLOAG. Additionally, Palestinian intellectual Naji Aloush was instrumental in negotiating Iraqi material support for the PFLOAG from Saddam Hussein in 1974, and Palestinian teachers and doctors, some of whom who had been dispatched by the PFLP, had been participating in revolutionary education and providing care to the Dhofaris since the late 1960s. Finally, the PFLOAG and the Palestinian forces that participated in the events of September 1970 in Jordan and after had some of the same allies. The Iranian People's Organization of Fada'i guerrillas that supported the Palestinians during Black September and subsequently carried out attacks in Jordan also supported the Dhofari rebels. They publicly condemned the Arab regimes helping the Sultan in Dhofar, of which the Jordanians were the most active and important, as, quote, Arab reactionaries, unquote. Thus, in conclusion, let us consider that after 1971, not only had the shared experience with Qaboos of facing an existential revolutionary threat, not only did Hussein have the shared experience of with Qaboos of facing an existential revolutionary threat, but he also knew that some of the same people who had worked against him in Jordan were active in the PFLOAG or supporting it. And several important Palestinian resistance groups shared the ideological commitment to revolutionary socialism. Lastly, consider that 1975, the same year that Hussein sent the troops to Dhofar, was the same year Lebanon began to come apart in the early days of the Civil War. This event made it conceivable that many Palestinian fighters would once again be on the move and potentially relocating to other parts of the Arab world. Therefore, I submit to you that King Hussein's military support of Sultan Qaboos against the PFLOAG had little to do, ultimately, with what was happening in Oman, but rather was about what had happened in Jordan and what was happening in the Levant in general. In this manner, by sending troops to Dhofar, Hussein was striking back and out against the groups that had sought to overthrow him, seeking to deny them a safe harbor, and, if the PFLOAG had been successful in its revolution, a potential ally. And so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. And now we come to the conclusion of the questions. We have any questions for Richard? Yes, sir.
Can you give us approximate numbers? How many Jordanians actually participate?
So that information is very difficult to find. And I think, kind of for somewhat obvious reasons, these operations weren't secret, but they were a bit clandestine. I have not been able to find any exact figures. I did just yesterday come across an article that a Jordanian scholar actually published on the Jordan Army's involvement in Dhofar. And I'm still waiting to get a copy of it from my library. It looks like he had access to what he calls the military archive. And it appeared from just doing a quick read through that he might have some more information on that. So if you're interested, once I get that article, I'll be able to share it with you. And I myself would like to take a look at it for continue to develop this project because I think it would have some useful information. But I don't know for sure how big a battalion would be in 1971 would be a good place to start 1975. And I'm afraid I don't know how big that would be.
For how long?
So they were there about 6 months. Yeah. So they left in September. So they would have come in like February, I think. That was the 91st Parachutist Battalion, but there were other officers before and after who stuck around and were involved in various training and support activities. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Two questions. One is, this is also a time when Oman was developing, not just militarily, but in terms of roads. Sultan Qaboos came in and he did a lot of building, a lot of development. Did Jordan contribute to any of that as part of this relationship that you outlined? And so the second question is sort of in the reverse. Is there evidence of Oman supporting Jordan through what was a tumultuous time for Jordan as well in the international sector, the United Nations, but also in Jordan's own conflicts in the region and friction with the other powers?
So as to the first question, I'm glad you asked that. That was one of those things I actually wanted to talk about in this presentation, but for lack of time. One of the things that I mentioned is that it's the Royal Engineers were involved, and what they were doing was they were actually building roads. And you can find, I found just today while I was over at the National Library in Al Dastur in 1975, there's an article that shows the construction of roads in Salalah, and it doesn't identify anybody involved as Jordanian, but we know the Royal Engineers were there, and we know that the real development with big multinational companies didn't really start until after the war was finished, when it was safe enough for that kind of thing to happen. And so it's pretty clear to me from reading the British Foreign Office sources that the Jordanians were helping build roads for the army, but also just as general development projects. Because, and this kind of connects to your second question, Qaboos was very adamant, him and his commanding officers in the army, was that it couldn't just be a military campaign. It also had to be the classic counterinsurgency hearts and minds campaign. And so the Jordanians were helping with that as well. So if you're Jordanian and you've ever been to Salalah, some of those roads there may have actually been built by your countrymen. So they did do some work initially. It looks like after they left, it was taken over by British companies, mostly like Halcrow Partners and Costons and whatnot. In terms of interaction after the war and sort of support going both ways, one of the things that Oman has been very good at since the time of Qaboos and down right to the present is that they have a very strict policy of neutrality. They don't go out of their way to aggravate anybody in the region. And so the support that they have given Jordan has been mostly, diplomatic overtures, kind words. There's been a number of state visits between Qaboos and Hussein in the 70s, in the 80s. I think the last one was in the early 90s, and I think it was Hussein going to Oman, but don't quote me on that. That's actually one of the things I want to sort of expand this project to include. And both times that they are covered in either the Jordanian press or the Omani press, it's front page news. It's a big story. There's pictures of the Sultan and the king, and so the relationship continued to be quite good. But I don't see too much as of yet support from the Omani side towards the Jordanians. The Jordanians, I do know, seem to have sent some experts in the fields of like healthcare and education subsequently, because Oman, after 1970, and particularly after the end of the war, was building that from scratch. So there was continued cooperation. I also know that at Jamiat al-Bayt here in Lufrak, there is an Omani studies unit that I'm hoping to get up to visit later this week while I'm still in Jordan. So, and that was, I think, a gift from Qaboos, not to Hussein, but to Abdullah, I think in the early 2000s. So the relationship has continued to be very good, but it's been mostly Jordan helping Oman, and then of course after 75 and after the oil crisis, Oman fortunes, literally its money, it grew hugely, and they didn't need as much help, and so there wasn't as much in the way of direct investment. But thank you for your question.
Are there any further questions? Well, thank you, Richard, for very interesting talk.
Thank you.
And we appreciate it, and we appreciate all of you coming. And with that, I believe there's some things, some snacks or whatever, and a reception. So you're all welcome. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.